Ramses was extremely brutal, which angered God. As a result, God sent 10 plagues to Egypt as a punishment for Ramses' evil deeds. The first plague was the plague of blood, which descended quietly from the Nile River. Numerous crocodiles suddenly became agitated. They surfaced and frenziedly attacked all visible living creatures in the water, not sparing even their own kind. Both people and boats were devoured by the crocodiles, and even the fish living in the water were killed, turning the whole Nile River a bright red with blood, rendering it foul-smelling and ultimately contaminating all of Egypt's domestic water resources. The appearance of this disaster was linked in a chain of events, not only leading to the extinction of fish living in the water but also as the polluted waters of the Nile continued to flow into the fields. This triggered the second plague, the plague of famine. Crops that should have been bountiful were all corroded overnight, resulting in a total loss of the hard labor of all Egyptian farmers. This was a severe blow to the people, causing Ramses to ask the high priestess to pray to the Egyptian gods to purify the water source. However, in the face of God, the Egyptian gods seemed to have disappeared. As people were still helplessly praying to the deities, God sent down the terrifying third plague, the plague of frogs. Countless frogs, having lost their aquatic environment, sprang from the lakebed. They attacked humans and even climbed up the entire Egyptian castle, swarming into human habitats. The frogs even made their way onto Ramses' bed. The queen screamed in terror, urging Ramses to think of a solution. Ramses, still dismissive, said, "They are just frogs." However, unbeknownst to him, the sheer number of frogs was overwhelming. Due to dehydration, they soon died en masse, and the rotting piles of corpses bred a large number of maggots, leading to an even more horrific fourth plague, the plague of flies. In no time, the breeding flies proliferated and soon covered the entire Egyptian sky, contaminating the little food people had left. Even burning with fire could not drive away the endless flies, and the air was mixed with a nauseating smell, forcing people to cover their noses and mouths, completely losing their ability to resist. Ramses had no choice but to call an expert to ask for a solution. The expert confidently said that this was nothing to worry about, and once the frog corpses decomposed, the flies would naturally disappear. However, these were not ordinary flies but biting flies, which after biting, would leave wounds and cause infections. Then came the fifth plague, the plague of boils. The boils began to spread rapidly among humans. People bitten by flies will have pustules on their skin for a short period of time. Ramses and all the royal nobles, including the queen, could not escape. Ramses could only watch his wife suffer painfully. With the medical capabilities of the time, there was nothing to be done but let the afflictions run their course, and some severely afflicted commoners even died on the spot, leaving the entire Egyptian populace in a state of panic and helplessness. At this moment, a guard brought in a white horse. On the horse, several lines of bloody text were clearly written. "These disasters are bestowed by God. Release 400,000 Hebrews to go home immediately. Otherwise, the disasters will not only continue but will become even more severe." It turns out that since Ramses' rule over Egypt began 400 years ago, the Hebrews had become slaves, helping Ramses build pyramids and statues, bringing a prosperous era to Egypt. After Ramses II ascended to the throne, he intensified his efforts. The first thing he did was to gather all the Hebrews to build his tomb and work them tirelessly day and night, causing countless Hebrews to die during the construction process. Ramses showed no sympathy and cruelly ordered those who lost their ability to work to be collectively burned. This completely enraged the God of the Hebrews, who then appeared as a young boy and found a man named Moses. He guided Moses to rescue the Hebrews suffering under harsh conditions and lead them out of Egypt. Thus, God sent 10 plagues upon Egypt, causing suffering for all Egyptians. However, faced with God's warning, one would think Ramses would compromise. Instead, Ramses declared himself a god, not only refusing to release all Hebrew slaves but also intensifying his harsh treatment of them due to his anger from the various disasters. This led to an increasing number of Hebrews dying under the harsh labor. This seemed to become a contest between man and God, which undoubtedly angered the Hebrew god further, leading to the sixth plague, the plague of livestock pestilence. All animals in Egypt began to contract the plague, whether it's the fullness that symbolizes Ramses' status or where the livestock people relied on for survival. All began to die from the plague. The continuous natural disasters once again dealt a heavy blow to the Egyptians, but Ramses still refused to compromise and again called the expert to seek a solution. However, this disaster far exceeded what the expert could understand. Attempting to bluff his way through again, he claimed that after a new round of maggots and flies completely decomposed the carcasses, everything would return to normal. Ramses, however, could no longer tolerate listening and in his anger, had the expert executed on the spot. Then Ramses called the high priestess again to seek a solution, but she indicated that she had already prayed to the Egyptian gods and still had not received a response. Unable to endure these superstitious lies any longer, Ramses, in his anger, also had her executed on the spot. The weather changed abruptly at night, with thunder and lightning, and hailstones the size of fists hailed down, sweeping across all of Egypt. The statue of the Egyptian goddess in the square was severely damaged, and houses were smashed to ruins. People working in the fields were killed or injured by the hail. The remaining crops in the fields were completely destroyed. Unusually large hail fell on a scorching day, clearly a divine sign, marking the seventh plague brought by God to Egypt, the plague of hail. Yet, the powerful hail did not make Ramses feel the deterrence of the divine. He only felt bursts of anger, which would undoubtedly lead to greater disasters. Moses watched all this unfold with his own eyes, his heart filled with grief, and at this moment, his faith began to waver. He cursed loudly at the heavens. Despite God's help, it was still the common people who died in the greatest numbers. He did not understand whom these successive disasters were truly punishing. He only hoped that from this moment on, God would stop all calamities. Without receiving an answer, Moses angrily departed, but God suddenly appeared behind him, indicating that he had not heeded Moses' advice. During the day, while people were working, the sudden drop in temperature provided favorable conditions for the hatching of insect eggs, leading to the eighth plague, the plague of locusts. Swarms of locusts swept in, tormenting all the people, who could only abandon their food and flee in panic. The dense swarms of locusts voraciously consumed everything they could, and in an instant, 15 million square kilometers of crops were utterly devastated. The locust army marched from the wilderness directly to the Egyptian city-states, even invading Ramses' palace, greedily devouring everything, and this self-proclaimed god of Egypt could only hide in his palace praying. Seeing the crops fail and the people in distress, the military officer suggested that Ramses open the granaries to help the civilians through the crisis. After the disaster passed, they planned to increase taxes to replenish the granaries. However, the selfish Ramses thought his interests would be harmed. He didn't care about the lives of the people and flatly refused. Once the news of the refusal to distribute grain spread, a group of famished civilians broke into the granary, frantically snatching up food with pots and pans. In the chaos, a farmer accidentally fell, and the torch in his hand instantly ignited the entire granary, destroying all the stored grain. Even though people managed to grab food and escape from the granary, they could not escape Ramses' punishment. Ramses' guards had already surrounded the area and ordered the killing of all the civilians. Arrows were launched in an instant. Faced with waves of arrows shot by the guards, the unarmed civilians could not fight back and were indiscriminately slaughtered, all becoming souls under the sword. Ramses watched silently as the inhumane slaughter enraged God further. Suddenly, a powerful thunderbolt struck, annihilating Ramses' guard unit without a trace and plunging all of Egypt into darkness. This was God's ninth plague, the plague of darkness. The so-called plague of darkness was due to sandstorms caused by the exposure of soil from the destruction of crops and landmark vegetation by the locusts. The unending darkness enveloped Egypt for 3 days and nights, finally instilling a hint of fear in Ramses, but it was followed by anger. When Moses came to negotiate, Ramses directly threatened that if the disasters continued, he would unleash his own plague, and all Hebrew children unable to walk would be drowned in the Nile River. Moses, hearing this, sought God, asking him to stop the calamities because too many innocent people were being harmed. But God grew angry, reminding Moses that the Hebrews had been enslaved for 400 years, enduring even more brutal torment, and no one had shown them sympathy. Upon hearing that the 10th plague would be more terrifying than the previous 9 combined, Moses declared he could no longer participate in such actions. However, God, to demonstrate his majesty, suddenly split the night with a burst of thousands of lights. In a moment of panic, Moses hurried to find Ramses, telling him that God had now lost reason, and if Ramses did not release 400,000 Hebrews to return to their homeland, millions in Egypt would die as a result. But Ramses didn't believe the threats, and he even drove Moses away. As Moses left, he warned Ramses to protect his child that night. Ramses felt a slight fear but considered it a threat. Meanwhile, Moses instructed all Hebrews in the city to slaughter extra lambs that night and smear the blood on their doorposts and lintels as a sign, advising them not to leave their homes. Although Ramses did not know what would happen, he felt uneasy for a moment, lit all the oil lamps in the palace, and stood guard beside his child with the royal sword in hand. Defiant Ramses believed in himself, convinced that man could prevail over fate. As night fell, a sinister and terrifying dark force slowly enveloped all of Egypt. As people slept, the 10th plague, the plague of the firstborn, silently descended. Because the Hebrews had previously smeared lamb's blood on their doorframes, God's judgment passed over their homes and did not afflict them. However, the firstborn of every Egyptian family and their livestock died mysteriously overnight. Even Ramses' only son was not spared. He held his child in despair, unable to accept the reality. Throughout the city of Egypt, the wails of grieving parents echoed. Thus, the plague of the firstborn unfolded. The previous plagues had led to a food shortage, and the top layer of the stored food had become contaminated with fungi due to insect excretion and sand dust. In ancient Egypt, it was customary for the eldest son to eat first and receive double portions, so the contaminated food on the top layer was consumed by the eldest sons, while the rest of the family ate the unaffected food below. Struck by such a calamity, Ramses could no longer stand it. The next day, he went to Moses to confront him, asking why they would do such a thing, questioning how such actions could be of God, and accusing them of being child killers. Moses was silent for a moment. Then he pointed out that not a single Hebrew child had died the night before, terrifying Ramses. He finally realized that the Hebrew God was a force he could not contend with, even surpassing all Egyptian gods. In his rage, Ramses shouted at Moses, ordering him to take all the Hebrews and leave Egypt for their dream homeland of Canaan. Thus, 400,000 Hebrews were finally freed from slavery. Moses, fulfilling his mission, led this massive group on their long-awaited journey back home, rescuing the Hebrews from centuries of severe oppression. Back in his palace, Ramses mournfully buried his child. While the queen had already gone mad, even though her child was dead, she kept frantically rocking an empty cradle. Ramses's hatred surged in his heart, and he could not swallow this bitter pill. He immediately summoned 500,000 cavalrymen. Taking advantage of the fact that the Hebrews had not gone far, he ordered an attack in the direction they were fleeing, determined to completely annihilate all the Hebrews. Moses soon received a report from his scouts. Ramses had deceitfully decided to commit genocide against the 400,000 slaves and was pursuing them day and night. At this rate, he would catch up in just 4 days. To escape urgently, Moses made a decisive decision to reroute the large group towards the rugged mountain roads, knowing the Egyptian forces would deploy many chariots to speed up the chase, and that mountain paths were typically narrow and steep, making it difficult for chariots to pass quickly. This not only allowed them to avoid the Egyptian army but also to reach the Red Sea 2 days earlier. When Ramses reached this fork in the road, knowing Moses well, he too chose this narrow mountain path. Moses and the 400,000 Hebrews traveled day and night for 2 days, finally reaching the Red Sea. But now there was no way to cross. With hundreds of thousands of pursuers rapidly closing in behind them, they were in a situation with no escape. All the slaves lost hope, resignedly laying down on the spot. Facing this predicament, Moses pondered deeply throughout the night, thinking of his wife and children, unwilling to give up, hoping for one more act of divine intervention, or else all the Hebrews would perish here. However, this time the Hebrew God did not respond to him, and in frustration, Moses threw his sword into the Red Sea, where it sank straight into the depths. Moses knew that attempting to cross the sea by force would lead to certain death by drowning. He sighed, realizing he had no choice, and decided it was best to rest for now. In the middle of the night, he awoke suddenly to see a meteor streak across the sky, seemingly falling into the sea in the distance. The next day, the surface of the sea began to teem with seagulls, and more mysteriously, the waters started to recede slowly. The sword Moses had thrown into the sea the previous night was now visible, exposed on the seabed. This miraculous scene stunned the hundreds of thousands present. Moses walked forward to retrieve the sword, understanding that this was a divine sign from the Hebrew God, guiding them to forge a path through the Red Sea to their homeland. He immediately gathered everyone to head towards the other shore. Yet, faced with the surging currents, everyone thought he was insane. No one dared to take the first step, but only Moses knew this was a revelation from God.
Follow me and you will be free.
Encouraged by Moses, the Hebrews put their trust in him, promptly gathering all their belongings to follow him across the Red Sea. As they ventured into the sea, the path ahead turned into a shallow bank. Meanwhile, the Egyptian army was rapidly catching up, the perilous mountain roads causing fear and trepidation, with any misstep potentially leading to a deadly fall. In his urgency to catch up to the Hebrews, Ramses disregarded all caution, ordering all chariots to maintain a speed of 200 kilometers per hour. However, the chariots had reached their limits. Commander Kian tried to advise Ramses, but he was consumed with the desire for revenge for his son. Then, one of the chariots accidentally struck a rock and overturned, throwing its guard under the vehicle. The following chariots couldn't stop in time, causing a series of collisions. The intense impact caused severe landslides along the road. Before even catching up to the Hebrew slaves, Ramses had already lost more than half his forces. Seeing the unfolding disaster, Ramses realized it was a divine warning, but his eyes were blinded by hatred, and he didn't care about the lives of his soldiers, continuing to order the remaining chariots to advance at full speed. Finally, they reached the Red Sea, just in time to see Moses leading the Hebrews farther away. Moses, noticing Ramses' troops descending the hillside, urgently shouted for everyone to run. "If we can make it to the mountains on the other side, we'll be safe," he said, staying behind with 2,000 Hebrew men to confront Ramses' army. as Ramses' 200,000-strong army charged forward. It seemed the two armies were about to clash, when the overcast sky again presented an eerie sight. Dark clouds, engulfed with lightning and storm, raced toward the battlefield. Even more terrifying was the sight as the Hebrews finally reached the far side of the strait. Several giant tornadoes rapidly converged, and massive waves suddenly rose from the ground, roaring towards the Egyptian army. Everyone was gripped by unstoppable fear. Ramses, witnessing this scene, was stunned. Clearly, the god of the Hebrews had intervened once more. Commander Kian urged Ramses to retreat, but Ramses, seized by a reckless fury, grabbed the reins and charged forward. As the cataclysmic natural disaster unfolded, Commander Kian, unwilling to follow Ramses to certain death, defied the command and ordered all soldiers to turn back. Seeing this, Moses also ordered everyone to retreat to the shoreline to regroup with the civilians, preparing for a final confrontation with Ramses. As the distance between the two leaders closed, the towering waves also rapidly approached. Moses stood his ground, waiting for the enraged Ramses to attack, but the waves were too fast, and the 200,000-strong army couldn't escape in time. They were all swallowed by the sea. The 500,000-strong army's charge had brought nothing but a tide of death. The fateful battle between Ramses and Moses never materialized, as both were also engulfed by the retreating waves. Only the Hebrews, having retreated to the mountains, survived successfully. Under the divine might of God, the Red Sea was refilled, and the bodies of countless soldiers floated in the water, becoming a feast for the crocodiles. The Hebrews who witnessed the miracle of the Red Sea were utterly convinced of God's power, embracing the Hebrew God as their true deity. Moses, however, did not die. He managed to swim ashore. God also spared Ramses, seemingly to make him realize who the true God was. Ramses, witnessing his fallen soldiers become food for the seagulls, felt profound guilt. Perhaps it was only at that moment that he came to a realization. Moses led the 400,000 Hebrews towards the land of their ancestors, Canaan. On the way, passing through his wife's homeland, Moses reunited with his son and the wife who had been waiting for him. When his wife saw the vast throng, Moses told her, "They are all my people." 3 months after leaving Egypt, Moses led the 400,000 Hebrews to settle in the wilderness of Sinai. The Hebrew God, however, shook his head at the sight of the multitude. He summoned Moses to the mountaintop, proclaiming the 10 Commandments, for they still had a long journey ahead. The Hebrews, more numerous than any tribe and comparable to a nation, would likely be seen as invaders in Canaan. Many Hebrews felt that with their large numbers and unified purpose, they could live a stable life. But Moses thought further. He pondered whether the people, once no longer fleeing, would still share common goals and unity as before. Thus, he established the 10 Commandments, inscribing them on stone tablets. These commandments became the ethical standards for future generations of Jews and Christians. The Hebrew God approved of his approach, saying profoundly to Moses, "Leaders perish, but the head never decays," meaning that leaders will eventually fade, but what is inscribed on stone will endure. These laws would guide them, ultimately leading them back to the sacred land of Canaan. After Moses' death, wars would continue in that region, and the people would still suffer hardships, but it was no longer a war of the gods, but an unending conflict between peoples. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.